They've been held for many long, agonizing weeks. The first batch of hostages kidnapped by Hamas militants during its October 7 terror attack on Israel have been released. It's part of a 4-day truce between Israel and the militant group, brokered by Qatar. Earlier on Friday evening, this convoy of Red Cross vehicles crossed from Gaza over the Rafah border crossing into Egypt, carrying 13 Israelis freed as part of a deal brokered by Qatar. Also in these vehicles were 10 hostages from Thailand and 1 from the Philippines, freed under a separate deal. The passengers were then met by Israeli soldiers for identification checks and then taken from Egypt back into Israel to major hospitals for medical treatment and to be reunited with their families. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the media after their release.
We have now completed the return of the first of our abductees, children, their mothers, other women. But I stress to you, to the families and to you, citizens of Israel, we are committed to the return of all of our abductees. This is one of the goals of the war, and we are committed to achieving all of the goals of the war.
And US President Joe Biden said the release of the hostages was the result of weeks of intense diplomacy. Here's some of what he had to say.
I've consistently pressed for a pause in the fighting for 2 reasons: to accelerate and expand humanitarian assistance going into Gaza, and 2, to facilitate the release of hostages. And over the past several weeks, I've spoken repeatedly with the Emir of Qatar, the President Sisi of Egypt, and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, to help secure this deal, to nail it down. And I want to thank all 3 leaders for their personal partnership to get this done. I spoke with the Emir and President al-Shifa and the Prime Minister Netanyahu again on Wednesday to confirm the elements of the engagement. As I said, today's release are the start of a process. We expect more hostages to be released tomorrow, and more the day after, and more the day after that. Over the next few days, we expect that dozens of hostages will be returned to their families. We also remember all those who are still being held and renew our commitment to work for their release as well.
In Germany, there is relief after 4 hostages holding German citizenship were among those released. Many of the people kidnapped by Hamas are dual citizens. The German nationals include a 77-year-old woman and a mother and her 2 daughters, aged 2 and 4. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock had this to say about their release.
I am immensely relieved that 24 hostages have just been released from Gaza, including 4 Germans. That a father, after 49 days of hell, of unbelievable anxiety, can finally hold his 2 little daughters and his wife safely in his arms again. My personal thanks go to my Qatari counterpart, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Egypt. But there are still over 200 women and men, and especially children, in the hands of Hamas. Our thoughts are with them today, and also with their families. As much as this day is a day of hope, it's not a day to breathe a sigh of relief.
So Hamas is due to release more Israeli hostages over the coming days, 50 in total, in exchange for 150 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails. On Friday evening, a group of 39 Palestinian inmates in the occupied West Bank were freed as part of the temporary truce. The group, made up of women and teenage boys, was released near Ramallah. Red Cross representatives were at the scene to collect them. The Associated Press reported that Israeli forces fired tear gas at Palestinian crowds in an attempt to push them back from the prison. And we're joined now by Middle East expert Daniel Gerlach. He's a journalist and editor-in-chief of the magazine Zenit here in Berlin. Daniel, tell me, how much of a political accomplishment is this deal?
It's a huge political accomplishment because the parties involved can show, and can also showcase, evidently, that negotiations work. It's a major breakthrough. I mean, I'm not saying that everything is going to be implemented according to plan. I'm not sure if maybe the ceasefire is going to be broken or interrupted. But the fact that in the middle of a war where you have one party doomed, which is Hamas, and the other side, Israel, declaring that it wants to annihilate Hamas. And still, we see that it's possible to negotiate deals between them. It's a risky strategy, and it took a lot of, I think, nightmarish headache on the side of the negotiators, namely the Qataris, the US, and the Egyptians. But it's interesting that it works, and we see that we shouldn't take all the information at face value. We have this massive destruction in the Gaza Strip, but at the same time, we have talks ongoing, we have negotiations, we have a certain readiness, even between the worst of enemies, to come to a deal. That doesn't mean that the war is over, it doesn't mean that the military campaign is over, and it doesn't mean that all the hostages are going to be released, but there is a model.
How instrumental was Qatar in this? Would we be here without Qatar today?
Hugely instrumental. The Qataris were the ones who, according to the information that I got, designed the process. And you can see the Qatari signature in much of what happened. First of all, they really did like playbook mediation, and it took me some time to understand. I followed it from the very beginning, actually. How they created expectations on both sides, how they shaped a narrative saying, look, Hamas did something terrible, but they didn't intend to do harm to such magnitude to the Israelis. They actually wanted to kidnap Israeli military and then negotiate the release of them in exchange for Hamas prisoners in Israeli prisons. I'm not saying that this is the true story, but it's a narrative to create expectations on both sides. Then they announced many times in a rather candor or openness, we are close to a deal. We have that number of hostages that can be released. We have the United States on board. We have the Israelis on board. Then they said, okay, the Israelis are not yet in. We have to convince Netanyahu. But they were, at the same time, very strategic and also strategically communicating or even sometimes transparent about their frustrations and their efforts. And it was quite interesting. They didn't want to sideline the Egyptians at the same time, which is very important. And of course, they needed to have the United States on board. It's a very interesting story, and I think, of course, it can't be written now, but it will be in the near future.
Now, this is a truce that is set to last 4 days for now. What happens on day 5 or whatever the day after may be?
Look, for the Israeli government, it is clear, and I think they have the support of a major part of the population, that a military campaign of some sort has to continue because they say they want to destroy Hamas. They want to end Hamas rule over the Gaza Strip, and they want to make sure that Hamas will never strike again at Israel. At the same time, they've said that before, and we have seen Israeli prime ministers in war saying, we will not leave unless we have killed every single one of them. But at the same time, then they were ready for some sort of a political compromise. What is clear for Israel, that a return to Hamas rule over the Gaza Strip is not an option. Maybe some sort of an Arab initiative could materialize, could crystallize, even though everyone is very careful about it.
They don't want a piece of this.
Because the framework isn't clear, and because they wanted to make sure that they don't have to pick up the pieces behind the destruction that Israel has caused in the Gaza Strip. But in general, I think some sort of an Arab engagement is possible and would also be the only reasonable way to put an end to this war. Netanyahu needs some sort of a face-saving solution at the same time. He needs a victory, and of course, the release of hostages is a major victory for him after all the failure and the dread that Israelis and Palestinians have suffered in the last couple of weeks.
Talking about the suffering in the Gaza Strip specifically, there have been calls all around the globe for a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. How do you think the international community, and especially countries like the United States and Qatar, are going to use the weight that they have in this to maybe change Israeli minds or exert some sort of pressure?
Look, the US-Qatari alliance is not a political alliance. It's not that they don't agree on all the aspects. The contrary is true. Like, I think the US are very clear that they don't call for a ceasefire, for a permanent ceasefire, because they think that Israel should have the right to continue the military campaign. At the same time, they see the devastation and destruction that this campaign has caused, which went beyond what can be considered an anti-terror operation.
Yeah, and the State Department says that they're not going to support it any longer if there's no plan for the Palestinians in southern Gaza.
True, but it took them quite some time to come to that statement. And on the other hand, you have the Qataris, who are, of course, pro-Palestinian, and who said from the very beginning that this operation is unjustified. So there's There's no agreement. We don't have an agreement even inside Europe about a ceasefire. The German government was very ambivalent and ambiguous about it. So I think a ceasefire is something that needs to come into operation with a success. And the hostages, though you should also look at them at the case in an isolated fashion, because it's not the only dossier that is happening here. But at the same time, I think the hostages can create trust between the negotiating parties, of which Hamas is not directly part. And that is, of course, a major challenge for diplomacy. But hey, these are the moments for real crisis diplomacy, for real professionals who I think can solve the situation, because you have reasonable people on the Israeli side who see that their military campaign with these consequences is, to say the least, not sustainable to the security interest.
You say there's not going to be a ceasefire until there is success. What would success look like?
That depends very much on of course, Hamas's behavior, Hamas's operation, and on the margin that you give them. You know, I'm drafting scenarios sometimes, and I don't want to say that all parties would agree to that, but let's just imagine that a group of Arab states would agree that they can provide some sort of a security and police force in cooperation with the Palestinian people, supported by the United States, the European Union, and eventually Israel. I think in such a scenario, it would be very, very difficult to swallow for Hamas, but I don't think they have major options. And let's not forget that there is countries in the region that have leverage over them. And Qatar is a small one, but a very important one.
That's Daniel Gerlach. Great speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Much more to talk about. Let's do that with Eran Lerman. He's a former Deputy National Security Advisor to the Israeli government and current Editor-in-Chief of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. Mr. Lerman, good to have you on the show. What are the chances of this temporary ceasefire turning into a permanent one?
I would say practically nil. The expectation of the Israeli people at large, and that goes from the traditional left and center to the right. It's not a matter of a government position or a group of hardened politicians. This is a public, very broadly held public sentiment that Hamas cannot be allowed to continue to govern Gaza. And the likelihood that they will lay down their arms and surrender or and basically find a way out of Gaza to be replaced by something more amenable to our future security and to the well-being of the Palestinian people is also more or less at zero. So the campaign is bound to continue until Hamas no longer holds sway over the people of Gaza and threatens Israeli security. And I don't see a point at this stage, much as we would all like this to end in a manner that does not require further military action. I don't see a way to do it. Try to imagine, frankly, what would be Europe would be like, what Germany would be like if there was a ceasefire in October 44.
Yeah.
And
would you say
somehow we...
Sorry, would you say that until now, though, the IDF mission... Would you say that until now, the IDF mission in Gaza has been a success?
Yes. It was very gradually carried out. It is very well coordinated. There are three elements involved: tactical intelligence, which recovered from the shock of October 7, very close support from the third dimension, from the air, that includes the Air Force and drones and all these elements, which are now temporarily held because of the pause in the fighting, and very disciplined progress by the ground forces. It's been painful. We've taken losses, but the results, I think, are well above what was expected when we originally launched the ground campaign. Mm-hmm. Much of the Hamas presence in the north has been destroyed. Other areas are now contained, and the capacity to destroy Hamas has been proven to exist.
Yeah. October 7th was, of course, an unprecedented attack on Israel. And in a recent article you wrote, you said it triggered an unprecedented response from Washington. And can you tell us briefly, maybe, what the U.S.'s role has been in shaping the aftermath of October 7th?
Well, the American response, I think, reflected first and foremost a recognition that the enormity of the crimes committed against people, I would say Jewish people, but some of the victims were actually Arabs, Bedouins in the Negev and others, but the enormity of the crimes committed by Hamas really raised shadows and memories from darker times in history. President Biden is certainly mindful of that. And in addition, they could see the hidden hand of Iran behind all this. And so what they did shape is the, let's say, the balance of deterring others, Iran and Hezbollah, from going all out into the war. Their choice was to go halfway in. Hezbollah has lost nearly 90 fighters already in confrontations with Israel. We have had to evacuate large areas of the north because of attacks on our civilian areas. Mm-hmm. But it is not yet the full-scale war of which they are capable. And this, to some extent, is due to the American deterrent.
And let's now bring in Marina Miron. She's a military analyst at King's College London. Marina, what does this truce mean for the IDF operation against Hamas in Gaza?
Good afternoon. Well, politically, it's a very important sign for Netanyahu and for his government. However, in terms of operations, we have heard the Qatari side explaining that they ensured that everything should be going according to the plan. However, ceasefires usually are very shaky, and there is a chance that it might break down, not because somebody voluntarily wants to break it down, but because of human error. So it's a very shaky process. At the same time, the IDF has to stay alert. It doesn't mean that the IDF can now relax for 4 days, because there will be people wanting to move to the north from the south on the one hand. On the other hand, Hamas might be taking this opportunity to regroup, recover, perhaps rotate personnel. It's very flexible. Now it has all the surveillance on the IDF operation, and so they can better estimate on how to proceed with their operation, because of course they don't want to be destroyed by the IDF, so they have to exploit their advantages in the Gaza Strip. So for the IDF, it's a very important moment, especially when it comes to the end of the ceasefire and how the operation will proceed after that. That is a big question.
Now, Marina, while we were speaking, we were looking at pictures, they're live pictures from the Rafah crossing showing relief trucks, or what I suppose are relief trucks crossing that border there into the Gaza Strip, all part of the agreement and the ceasefire. Let me ask you, militarily, has Hamas anything to gain from this truce?
Well, obviously, as I said, they're gaining time, and they have the strategic asset, and that strategic asset are the hostages, meaning that Hamas could say, we will release another 10 for another 24 hours of ceasefire if they see fit. And this is very problematic. In the meanwhile, while the humanitarian aid is arriving, Hamas is very well entrenched in Gaza, meaning that even people who are not actively supporting Hamas might be coerced to support it. What I'm trying to say is, for instance, hospitals might be coerced to host Hamas's command and control centers, presumably, just in theory. The other possibility is that Hamas might be getting some of those humanitarian supplies to ventilate the tunnels, because tunnel ventilation has been a huge problem, and that is what Israel was trying to prevent by cutting off fuel to the Gaza Strip. So Hamas can use this pause to recuperate, to readjust its operations, and to select new targets, to try to confuse the IDF, to move hostages. So there are many things that could be happening. And for Hamas, of course, it is also a strategic victory, because they are dictating essentially the terms of how this ceasefire is going to work, how this deal is going to work.
Now, Marina, what do you think is likely to happen when that 4-day ceasefire has ended and is not being extended?
Well, I think that the operations will resume as usual, and the IDF will try to pick up where it left off before the ceasefire started, because as we know, up until the point when the ceasefire was enacted, the IDF was continuing its operation. It didn't decrease the intensity of the operation. The problem is that there is a certain momentum. I explained in the previous answers that Hamas might be using this time for IDF. It's of course difficult to connect from where they left off to 4 days later, because the circumstances might have changed. So there will be an additional challenge for the Israeli intelligence to try to see what is happening while the ceasefire is ongoing, in order to update their targeting information, in order to adjust their decision-making and to adjust their plan on the ground with the exigencies of the situation at that moment. And I think that unless there is another negotiation to release additional hostages, the war will continue as before.
The military analyst, Marina Miron, there speaking to us. Thank you very much, Marina.